Jesus said to his disciples, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is at hand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Let those within the city escape from it, and let those in the countryside not enter the city. For these days are the time of punishment, when all the scriptures are fulfilled. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days, for a terrible calamity will come upon the earth, and a wrathful judgment upon his people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be taken as captives to all the Gentiles. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth nations will be in dismay, perplexed by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will die of fright in anticipation of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these signs begin to happen, stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand." The Gospel of the Lord. I have some apocalyptic readings today. I'm not going to talk about that because today's Thanksgiving. However, I do want everybody to know this Monday I'm going to start giving a two-part series on the book of Revelation at Wabash College. So if anybody's interested in learning more about the apocalypse, you can come to that. Buenos días a todos. Hoy es el día de acción de gracias. Entonces, lo que vamos a hacer hoy es, voy a dar gracias por la llegada de la fe en nuestra tierra. Voy a contarles la historia. I think it's always good on Thanksgiving Day for us to give thanks for the fact that our faith has come to this nation, right, into this land. Many of us, when we were younger, right, we heard the stories about the Mayflower and about the arrival of the Pilgrims, right? And that's actually a later part of the story than what had already been taking place. The story of Christianity coming to our land exists long before the Mayflower, right, and the Pilgrims coming from England. There's many myths about this story, by the way. A lot of people think, for example, that the Puritans, the Pilgrims, they were actually freeing from being persecuted by the Catholic Church in England. It's actually untrue. In England in those days, it was the Anglican Church who was in authority, right? And they were persecuting all sorts of Christians, including Catholics. It wasn't until the 1800s or the late 1700s that Catholics actually began to have civil rights again in England. It was a very ugly time for a couple of centuries there. But our story, right, the story of our faith arriving to this land, right, it's a story of God's providence, and it's also a story of courage, of men and women seeking to bring the faith to this continent. Right, so many of you know, right, the first major person to bring the faith to the continent is Christopher Columbus. Right? Christopher Columbus. Now in our modern age, right, we always need to keep in mind that when we're learning history in our modern era, there are many prejudices that historians are bringing to these stories. Christopher Columbus, for many centuries, was considered a great hero. In fact, his name, Christopher Columbus, right, that wasn't his real name, right? His real name was Cristobal Colon. Does anybody know what Christopher Columbus means? It's a Latin word, right? It means the Christ-bearing dove. That became basically like his nickname, right? Because when he landed in North America, the first thing he did was he planted a cross on the shore, claiming this land for Christ. And of course, one of the first things they did was have Mass after arriving at the continent. Many people in our modern age, they think that Christopher Columbus was like this terrible person. And again, it's because of the prejudice of modern historians. Most of the stories that we get about Christopher Columbus that talk about him in a bad light, they all come from his chief political rival who was constantly trying to undermine him during his time in North America, right? So it's kind of as silly as maybe like 300 years from now when somebody wants to learn about Donald Trump, right? The only source they look at as all the things that Hillary Clinton ever said about him, right? It's just ridiculous. Christopher Columbus was an extremely devout Catholic, and his main motivation in coming to North America and trying to find the Indies, right, was he wanted to bring the faith to the Indies. Right? Also, by the way, another myth of modern history, right? Christopher Columbus is not the person who discovered that the earth was not flat. Okay? Again, that is a myth of modern history. Some historians try to make the Middle Ages make it look like everybody was really stupid back then, and so one of the things they made up was, people used to think the earth was flat. Think about how silly that was. You think those people in the Middle Ages would have looked at the sun, which was clearly round, the moon that was clearly round, all the planets that were clearly round, and then they would have concluded that the earth was flat? No, it's ridiculous, right? If you don't believe me, look at the Summa Theologia of St. Thomas Aquinas. One of the first questions in there is about the perfect spherity of the earth, right? Why the earth is a perfect sphere. What Christopher Columbus was wrong about is that he actually thought the planet was a lot smaller than it was. Even before the days of Christ, there were some ancient astronomers who were able to calculate the circumference of the earth, and they were actually really accurate. And so the reason why Christopher Columbus had such a hard time finding people to support his voyage is because they thought he was being stupid, right? They thought surely he was going to die. The earth was much bigger than what he was calculating. And sure enough, right, if North America hadn't been in the middle of his path, they all would have died, right, who were on his ship, right? So he was incorrect about that, right? But so the journey of our faith starts with courageous people like Christopher Columbus who decided to travel into those foreign seas and to bring the faith here. Okay? And when people arrived on this continent, they didn't exactly find nice, peaceful, God-loving people. It depended on who they encountered. Right? Some of the first people that Christopher Columbus and Hernan Cortez and some of the other explorers, the first peoples they found were very violent people. And many times they were cannibals. Right? This is where the word for cannibal actually entered into the English language, was when people started arriving in North America. Many of the tribes were cannibals. So that's how the story begins. And there's a lot of providence that took place along the way. As people began to try to establish the faith in the continent. In Mexico, for example, we were greatly assisted by the appearance of Our Lady Guadalupe in 1531, right? The Aztec peoples had rebelled against many of the Spanish missionaries, right, for a long time. And many of the Spanish people were not treating the natives very kindly. And so thanks be to God, Our Lady Guadalupe appeared in 1531, right, which we're going to celebrate in a couple of weeks. That was God's providence in establishing the faith in the continent. And then as time progressed, people started to progress northward, right, and get into the land of the United States, which we now call the United States, right? One of my favorite stories about the faith coming into the United States was in New Mexico and Arizona and Texas in that area. Right? When missionaries, they had been in Mexico for a number of years, and when they began to go north into what we now call the United States, something very interesting happened. Some of the priests went north, and when they arrived, some of the natives, they said, "Oh my gosh, we're so glad you're here. We want to be baptized." And these priest missionaries were saying, "What are you talking about? You want to be baptized? We've never even been here before. How do you know about the faith?" And they said, "Well, this lady in blue has been teaching us and telling us about you and that you were going to come." Right? And as the missionaries began to investigate it a little bit more, one of the priests heard about a woman in Spain who was a cloistered nun who was having visions about the New World. And it turns out that there was this nun in Spain. She had been bilocating. She bilocated over 500 times from her cloistered convent in Spain to the New World. One of those missionaries actually, years later, he actually went and interviewed this nun in Spain, right? And she was telling him about all the different people in the New World, right? And so it was proof that this had really been happening, right? Wow, that's pretty amazing, right? Man. Her name was Sister Maria Jesus of Agreda. She's never been officially canonized by the church because she wrote a bunch of things. She was a visionary person, and At the time she was having the visions, the church was a little bit unsure about some of the theology in her visions. But an amazing, miraculous story, right? Here in our very own nation, right? In what we now call the Southwest of the United States. This nun who was bilocating across the world over 500 times, multiple times a day, teaching the natives about Christianity, right? Amazing stuff. But not only was this journey of the faith being planted in our nation, not only was it providential, but it was also based on the courage of many men and women. Not only those first explorers who took the dareful journey, right, to come across, but then also very courageous missionaries. One of the most inspiring saints in church history is St. John de Brebeuf, right, and St. Isaac Jogues, right? Brebeuf High School over by Zionsville is named after St. John de Brebeuf. And I'm sure St. John de Brebeuf is rolling over in his grave, right, at how un-Catholic Brebeuf High School is nowadays. But anyway, that's a story for another day. Right? When many of the Jesuit missionaries began to enter into the United States in places like Ohio and New York, right, they were shocked at some of the things that they discovered when they arrived. Some of the native tribes were very peaceful, and they were very open to the gospel. But some other tribes were extremely violent. Right? St. John de Brebeuf actually wrote in his diary one time that when he arrived, he said it seemed like the whole continent was possessed by the devil. Right? That's how evil some of the practices were that the Indians did. So St. John de Brebeuf, right, not only was he courageous enough for coming over to the continent, I mean, imagine what it would have been like for an original missionary. Right? Being halfway across the world from home, being in this completely foreign land, right? Think of the United States back before there were buildings and schools and hospitals, just forests. Not knowing what you were going to encounter. And many times when missionaries would arrive, sometimes the Indians, because they were wearing black robes like priests, right? Sometimes the Indians just killed them on the spot, right? Without even talking to them. Because they saw them as like this magician kind of a person. So when you were a Jesuit missionary, not only did you know if you were ever going to encounter an actual tribe without being killed first, but then once you arrive, right, then you have to learn this completely new language. And the people were very superstitious. So whenever there was any sort of illness going around, or there was a bad harvest, guess who oftentimes was suspected as causing it? And it's that mysterious man in the black robe. There's some great movies that have been made about this, by the way, that you can watch. There's a movie called The Black Robe. There's also a movie called The Mission, right? It kind of gives an example of what it was like for these missionaries. But then not only that, right? After you spent all this time with these tribes, you always had to worry about what was going to happen when one of those tribes' enemies was going to come. And that's what happened with St. John de Brebeuf and St. Isaac Jogues both, right? They were ministering to Huron Indians, and one of the enemies of the Hurons was the Iroquois. All of us know about the Iroquois from our history classes. The Iroquois were a very violent people. And when they captured other Indian tribes, they kind of had these weird obsessions with torture, and they tried to put people under extreme torture. Sometimes they would even do it to their own people. And so St. Isaac Jogues, famously, for example, was captured and was tortured for many hours, and somehow actually managed to escape and actually went back to France for a while. The Indians had actually cut off 2 of his fingers because they thought that these fingers that priests have, and it's the source of their power because it's with these fingers that they bless people. It's with these fingers that they anoint people. It's with these fingers that they hold up the Eucharistic host. Right? And so they actually chewed off his fingers, and people were mesmerized by that when he went back to France. And out of the courage of St. Isaac Jogues and out of the love he had for those people, bringing the gospel to them, he actually amazingly returned. Right? After barely escaping with his life and going back to France, he actually decided to come back and continue ministering to those Indians. Right? And St. John de Brebeuf as well. St. John de Brebeuf was captured with a number of his brothers. Right? When the Hurons knew that the Iroquois were coming, they begged him to flee and go elsewhere, but he refused to leave his flock. And so when he was captured, he was made an example of. Everybody knew that he was the leader of the priests and the leader of the tribe. So they put him under extreme tortures. They put burning hot metals and arrowheads over his chest on a necklace so that he would have to move back and forth and be burned on his chest on his back. They poured boiling hot water over his head to mock baptism. Because he was so courageous and so strong, he kept preaching and encouraging his brother priests, and so eventually the Indians actually cut out his tongue so that he wouldn't be able to speak and preach anymore. And when he finally died, the Indians actually ate his heart because they believed that if you ate the heart of a courageous man, you might take some of his courage onto yourself. That's an amazing story of a courageous martyr, a man out of love for God, who came all the way across the world just to bring our amazing and beautiful faith to this people, to this land seemingly possessed by the devil. When we think about all the things to be grateful for on Thanksgiving Day, our families, our freedom, all these things, nothing compares to the unbelievable grace that we have, having our faith. Thanks be to God for the providence that He brought about all of this history in bringing our faith to this land. Thanks be to God for all those courageous men and women, those holy men and women who sacrificed so much just so that Christ could be planted here on this continent. And that you and I could be here today celebrating the sacrifice of the Mass. That God truly reigns in this land. And that His name is glorified in this land. And that we have the amazing grace of being His sons and daughters, members of His kingdom in this